Along this election campaign, the NDP leader Jagmeet Singh has said, or he suggested that he's willing to work with other parties. He's since walked back some of those comments. The Prime Minister has seemed to dodge the issue of working with other parties, thereby forming a coalition government. He said that he wants to elect a progressive government, or he'd rather that Canadians elect a progressive government and stop conservative cuts. Andrew Scheer has said that only a conservative majority would stop an NDP Liberal coalition government. What is a coalition government?
Well, coalition government has a particular meaning, which is that essentially you have sharing out of cabinet seats. You don't just have two parties aligned with each other, but they're actually joining in a single fused government. That's very unusual in Canadian politics, particularly at the federal level. What's more likely to see happen, if anything happens, would be what's called a supply and confidence agreement, or an agreement by one party to support the other party when it came to confidence votes, budgets, which are supply motions, that kind of thing. And it's certainly possible you could see that. It's certainly possible we could see all kinds of things after this election. It is so close. This is the closest election, if on current trends, since 1972, which was also a minority government involving a prime minister named Trudeau. Right now, if you look at it, both the Conservatives and the Liberals are in the 130s, the low 130s. The NDP and the Bloc are both in the mid-30s. You add together the Liberals and the NDP, or the Tories and the Bloc, which are the two combinations that people have talked about, neither of them reaches a majority. So what you may actually be talking about, if there's going to be anybody going to be able to form a government, would be a three-party arrangement of some kind. So we're in for some, if the present trends hold, in for some interesting discussions after the election.
So let's talk about some of the alliances that you have mentioned, like the NDP, like the Liberals. What happens there? I mean, who decides, who takes on what roles? What happens in cabinet? How do you divvy up those roles? Don't you ultimately take this to the Governor General, who was appointed by the Liberal government? How does all of that play out?
There's a lot of ifs there and a lot of buts. The first thing to remember is the sitting Prime Minister is the Prime Minister, and he has the right, whatever the result of the election, he has the right to go back to Parliament if he chooses, and try and form a government if he thinks he can. So there's no rule beyond that to start with. The second rule is that whoever commands a majority of the House of Commons has the chance to be the Prime Minister, will ultimately be the Prime Minister. So if the Prime Minister goes to Parliament and tries to get his budget through, tries to get a speech from the throne through, and Parliament defeats him right away, then you get into some interesting waters, because one of two things could happen. Either the Prime Minister could resign and advise the Governor General to call an election, dissolve Parliament, call an election, or the Governor General could instead call upon somebody else to try and form a government if she thought that there was some other combination of parties that could be a stable government. She's not going to do it if she thinks it's just going to be more chaos and confusion, and the government would just collapse in a few days. So those first days and weeks and months of after the election are going to be very interesting to see. Let's supposing that the Liberals have enough seats with the NDP to form a government. We might have a scenario where the Liberals have fewer seats than the Conservatives, and right now there's a strong possibility of that. And you're already starting to see the Conservatives saying, "Oh, that's dirty pool. It's the government, it's the party that has the most seats that gets to form a government." That's not true. It may have been the convention. It may be that that's often the case. People make political decisions, but as a matter of how our system works, it's whoever can command a support of the majority of the seats. So if the Liberals and the NDP together have a majority of the seats, it doesn't matter whether the Tories have more seats than them. The details of that plan would remain for negotiation. A lot of it would depend upon their relative bargaining strengths, who most feared having another election for that kind of thing, who thought they had the winds in their sails in terms of public opinion. As I said off the outset, I'd be surprised if it went as far as a coalition, as an actual divvying up of seats. Just because our system just doesn't seem to encourage that. The leaders in our system are so dominant that I don't think they want to share the power of deciding who gets cabinet seats. It's more likely to be some sort of thing like you saw in BC, where the smaller party agrees to support the larger party when it came to confidence votes.
I guess on that note, what do you make of a possible, Tory and Bloc Quebecois alliance. I mean, that's a real unusual one.
Yeah, and the Conservative leader, Andrew Scheer, has said he's not going to do that. Now, you have to take everybody's word on this with a bit of a grain of salt. People say things before elections that somehow get unwound after the election. But I do think he'd be playing with fire to get into any kind of formal arrangement with a party that, to this day, they may put on the back burner, but they are basically committed to the breakup of Canada. I think both of them would realize that would probably not be a smart solution. What you could see, if the Conservatives have a strong enough plurality, even if they don't have a majority, if they're close to the 169 that you need or 170 that you need, you might see them just simply do what Stephen Harper did through his minority years, which is you just put forward legislation, you kind of dare the opposition to defeat you. And what you're counting on there is just the political calculations of the parties. The reason Stephen Harper was able to do that was it took three parties combined, that was the numbers in those parliament, it took three parties combined to defeat him. So all three parties would have to agree at the same time that they wanted to bring the government down and force an election. It's rarely the case that all of them will see it in their interest, because if one's up in the polls, typically the other will be down in the polls. So, and that's if you've been able to sustain the government long enough that the alternative to the defeated government will be an election. So it's those first few months where the convention, and none of these conventions are set in stone, and there's some disagreement among experts around the edges, but the general sense is if the government is defeated in the first 6 months, you'd probably call upon another government to another party to try and form a government rather than going to election. But past that, if you get into a year or 2 years, then it's more likely that if the government is defeated, you go to fresh elections. And as I say, Stephen Harper was able to find the sweet spot where none of them wanted to bring him, they didn't all want to bring him down at the same time. And that may be how a Tory minority might be able to govern.
I'm curious about what happens then to specific issues like pipelines, like Trans Mountain. How does all of that play out?
It's again, like all these questions, the only correct answer is I don't know. But if you had a liberal NDP, Trans Mountain might survive. In fact, I think it probably would. The NDP are not as absolutist in their opposition to pipelines as the Green Party is. They've got union members, for example, who would like to be building those pipelines. And I have a hunch that they could probably fudge something that would still see Trans Mountain getting built. If the Greens are involved, that's a different matter. And as I say, right now, the Liberals and the NDP don't have enough together to form a government. If the Greens are involved, it's hard to see how that pipeline gets built. And if that's the case, you have some real issues for the country. I mean, if Alberta is told finally and fully that you don't get to build a pipeline, that you're landlocked for your oil, they'll be hell to pay. It'll be a very, very difficult situation for the country. So that's one of those interesting imponderables going into this election.
Interesting times for the country when you see parties like the Greens, the Bloc, and NDP as disruptors.
Oh, and not even just them. It's not hard to look, when you look at where the numbers are right now, it's conceivable you could have a situation where Maxime Bernier and or Jody Wilson-Raybould, supposing they both get elected in their seats, that they could have the balance of power. It's that tight. So in other words, it could be, if you had the Tories, the Liberals and the NDP and the Greens might together only have 169, which is exactly half, but remember you have to appoint a speaker. We're back into that whole situation, potentially, that they had in BC, where you, by appointing a speaker, you lose your majority. So one or more of the independents or single-person parties may themselves be important players in this. So it's a very interesting dilemma for everybody.